guess that sort of brings us to the end here. Nothing like being the last presenter before a lunch, so I'll try to be respectful of everyone's time. In case you missed the opening talk, I'm Greg Dobson. I'm also with UNC Asheville's NEMAC here, and I do a lot of our GIS and related activities, coordinate a lot of our GIS activities. And what I want to talk to you about today is how can we take a lot of the data and information and research and other aspects that we've seen throughout the morning presentations, and how can we actually get those into the hands of decision makers that need to be using that type of information to make decisions that impact our local community here. So, a lot of us in the room are certainly used to and comfortable with looking at weather and climate and hydrological data and information, although even for us it can be difficult to interpret sometimes. So imagine trying to put that in front of decision makers, a lot of whom don't necessarily have a scientific background, many of our elected officials, and perhaps more importantly the general public. How do we present this information to this group of people in a way that they can easily interpret, they can easily make meaning from, they can easily use and access? This is the real challenge with a lot of the presentations that we've heard this morning, is how do we actually present this information in a way that the people that need to actually be using it can do so effectively. And so that's a lot of what we do in our center here at UNC Asheville at NEMAC, is we try to take a lot of these different types of data sets. Again, maybe it's weather, climate, hydro. We do a lot of work, as Jim mentioned earlier, with the Forest Service and other groups. How can we take a lot of this, scientific, raw data and turn that into useful information? And so there's kind of a four-step process that we use to do that, where we can take the data and information, we can clean it up, do any kind of processing that needs to be done, integrate multiple data sets. We can then turn those into visualizations, and a lot of that, we've seen a lot of examples of some of those throughout the morning, geospatial, GIS-based visualizations. But then we got to keep going with that, and we got to kind of help tell that story. So it's not necessarily enough to just create a cool looking map or a 3D poster or whatever it might be. We need to be able to provide some context to that, some narrative to that. So that's kind of the third process. And then lastly is facilitate that group decision making. And this kind of talks a little bit about the same thing, but with a few more specifics. So, in terms of visualizing and creating these visualizations of data and information, we can use GIS and other software and hardware tools to help do that. We can then distribute that information, across the web via different web tools. We can build online geospatial viewers, GIS viewers. But again, it's also, how do we communicate and explain that information? And then, ensure that the right people, the decision makers, are able to use that information in a facilitated process. So I'll talk a little bit about GIS and 3D capabilities and how that kind of feeds into visualizing some information. I'm going to start with just a really, pretty simple map here, but this is a concept that we've, referred back to throughout the morning, and that's just this idea of here in Western North Carolina, we have complex terrain, we have complex precipitation patterns. Just because it's not raining necessarily a whole lot in downtown Asheville doesn't mean that it's not raining a whole lot up in the higher reaches of the watersheds. And a lot of that is due to the Eastern Continental Divide that runs through here, which essentially creates a lot of orographic enhancement. It works to enhance rainfall rates as rainfall moves up and over the mountains. And so we have a lot of that, going on here throughout Western North Carolina. It's pretty interesting that, the wettest and the driest locations in North Carolina and just about the wettest and driest locations east of the Mississippi are, only separated by about 50 miles. So just a simple example of presenting that type of information in a little more graphical way. Again, this idea of 3D kind of is a way we can bring 2D data to life. So on the left is an example of just some floodplain maps, and we've seen lots of examples of these this morning. And they're really great. Planners and engineers and scientists and other folks can look at a map on the left and get the information from that they need. But when you present that to someone on a city or county council or some other decision maker, that's not always as intuitive for that person to ascertain that same information. And so by presenting it perhaps in a 3D fashion, they can start to say, oh, well, I recognize that ridge line, or I recognize, my house there. And, you try to make it a little more meaningful and a little more intuitive for them. And so we've done a lot of that over the past 8 years, as McCrae and Jim have referred to, the Flood Damage Reduction Task Force that spun up following the floods of 2004. And a lot of the early work we did during that time was to take a lot of the data and information and put that into these different 3D products. Here in the lower left, we've got building footprints, which are essentially the outlines of every building in the county. We now have that actually for the entire state. Extrude those to known heights and make them look realistic and say, okay, well, how's water interacting with that? McCrae in his talk earlier referred to the new floodplain maps that were developed as a result of the floods, and that process was kind of already underway, but it had gotten kind of bogged down a little bit, and so that flood event issued in more funding and allowed that to kind of wrap up. So we're able to compare those in a 3D way, so you can actually kind of see the differences in those. Just situational awareness, again, what do some of these watersheds look like? And so we've talked a lot this morning about the North Fork Reservoir just up above Black Mountain. Again, this is where the city and the county gets a majority of its drinking water from. What does that look like? And so if you start trying to think about a lot of rain up in these upper reaches here, 10 to 20 inches of rain up in this area, you can get a better perspective. It's a bowl that's going to fill up, and if you don't properly manage the reservoir there, you could risk breaching the dam, as we talked about earlier, and then all that obviously is going to come downstream. And so, it's just a great, situational awareness tool. Here's the same view, but with impervious surfaces as an overlay. And so, obviously, we know that the more built environment that we have, the more roadways, the more buildings, the more rooftops, the more that runoff that we're going to have. And so here's kind of what that looks like there in the upper portions of the watershed. Rick talked a lot about landslides and steep slopes earlier, and so here's what those look like for the Swannanoa watershed. And obviously as we move further north, or I should say further east up into the watershed, the terrain gets more complex, the steeps become greater, the slopes become greater, and that too is going to impact not only flash flooding but landslides as well. Jim showed this in his talk first thing this morning, but again, it's just this idea of trying to communicate, this idea of orographic enhancement. And again, down here in the valley, we may not get as much rain as they do in the upper reaches of the watershed, often, again, due to just precipitation moving up and over these ridges and mountains. And then, we can start to take some of these building footprints that I showed in an earlier slide and start to actually build those out in a little more detail. So there's technology that allows us to go out in the field and we can take pictures of buildings, and we can, with the software that's available to us, we can do all kinds of real modeling and design, and so now when an elected official or a decision makers looks at this image of Biltmore Village, they can start to pinpoint out particular buildings, and again just make it a little more meaningful. So, that's kind of the first step. We've got all these, different, visualizations and maps and graphics, but now we want to be able to distribute that and get that information out to the people that need to be using it. And so we can do that through the web tools. Obviously, we live in a society today where everything's web-based, right? We can get to anything we need, not just from our desktop computers anymore, but from our smartphone and other devices. And so we want to be able to help facilitate that process a little bit. One of the things that we put together several years ago is just this integrated map viewer that combines hydro and precipitation data. So it's not enough to look at these things individually, but we want to be able to look at them in combination. So here we've got a view of the French Broad River at Asheville, and this is during the 2004 floods, and we can see the peaks there from Francis and Ivan. And then we can also start to look at some of the precipitation gauges. So here's the one for Asheville, where we could see, not a whole lot of rainfall fell, but then when we look at the Mount Mitchell station, a lot of rain fell. And again, all that water comes downstream and comes into our watersheds. Here's another tool that we built specifically for the Buncombe County Emergency Management community when they were updating their FEMA hazard mitigation plan several years ago. And so this is an online web-based tool that combines floodplain information as well as landslide data, wildfire data. It's got paths of high-risk dam failures and just a whole variety of different hazard-related data sets where we can put all those into an integrated viewer and combine those with, say, parcel data. And then you can start to generate these reports that can give you some idea of risk and vulnerability. So if you've got a piece of property, how much of it might be impacted by a 100-year or 500-year floodplain. And so you can start to access that type of information. And again, these tools are not, they don't take training to learn how to use them. They're intuitive. They work on a variety of platforms and devices, and so we're trying to make it easy for people to access this kind of information. But again, sometimes it does take that extra step. So we've got these tools and we've got these different products, but sometimes we still need to kind of help facilitate that decision making just a little bit further. And so another thing that we can do is create these virtual environments. And so if someone wants to, again, better understand what these watersheds and what these rising floodwaters look like, well, we can create these GIS-based 3D animations. And I'm not going to take the time to try to show one of these right now, but you can go to our NEMAC Asheville YouTube channel and take a look at these. But we can create these virtual fly-throughs, these simulations, if you will. And again, just another way to educate folks about the local environment and kind of show them how all these processes work together to cause the floods that we saw in 2004. It can be even just simple things, just adding some context to a map. Here's a real simple example of a story map, if you will. Here we've got the Swananoa watershed. In 2004 we had all this rain, 10 to 15 inches of rain. All that comes downstream, and we have some pretty significant flooding in Biltmore Village on the Swananoa River, and there's a picture of what that looked like. But we can do this in a little more detailed fashion as well. So we put together a flood tour booklet that a lot of local decision makers and other people here locally have been on. And so it basically is a tour of the watershed and provides before and after pictures of a lot of the significant areas where flooding occurred. And so we've got these maps, and we can pull in these different pictures and create a story map, if you will. And so we're effectively telling the story with maps and other 3D products. And then finally we try to one of the things that we've done is try to help facilitate some of this group decision making. And so we have a a downtown engagement center, for those of you that don't know, downtown in the Grove Arcade, and we've got some different technologies there, one of which is a vis wall, a large display where we can bring up a lot of these different pieces of information simultaneously and get people around that, and just try to help facilitate this planning, this decision making, and presenting all these different data sets and information in an integrative way, so that this decision making can take place. And with that, I will, in the respective time, sort of wrap up. And we've got maybe about 5 minutes or so if the other presenters want to come up, and we can take a few questions.